It Tore the Laugh from My Throat by Meriah Crawford. I was supposed to be on vacation. I was supposed to be relaxing, putting my feet up, reading. I was supposed to be eating locally caught seafood like drum, soft-shell crab, and oysters dug fresh. I was supposed to be sitting on the porch of my little rental cabin on Chincoteague, enjoying the break I'd earned after nearly 4 solid months of long hours, 7-day weeks, and living out of my car while working on a huge class action lawsuit. The phone was not supposed to ring, and if it did, I was not supposed to answer. But it did, and I did, and this is what happened. Is this Lauren? Lauren Lindsay. I could tell from the voice that something was very wrong. Yes, I said. My name is Harriet Reynolds. I was Jess Walter's college roommate. Jess is a lawyer friend of mine who I work for as a private investigator. She sometimes referred clients to me, but she also knew how much I needed this time off. It's my husband, she said, her voice breaking. He's missing. Harriet began sobbing. I could almost feel her body shaking over the phone. I'd had people start crying before, usually while telling me they suspected their husband or wife was cheating on them, but not like this. I waited for a couple of minutes until the storm began to ease, then said, as gently as I could, I'm so sorry about your husband. Tell me what I can do to help. I want you to find him. Please. Though I was exhausted and reluctant to take any new work on, for Jess' sake, I decided to at least hear her out. I pulled out a notebook and pen and sat at the small dining table to take notes. Her husband, Tom, a retired bank manager, went to visit his mother one afternoon, just over a week ago. Harriet stayed behind because of a migraine and went to bed early. When she woke up at almost 8 the next morning, Tom still hadn't come home. Harriet called his mom, who told her that Tom left just after 11 the night before, saying he was going straight home. Harriet then began a frenzy of phone calling, hospitals, the police, friends and family in the area. Nothing. After another call to Tom's mother, who was starting to get frightened, Harriet drove the route to her house and then back by a slightly different path. There was no sign of him. Nothing at all. Later that same day, she told me, the police found Tom's car parked at the edge of a field. It was a couple miles off his expected path, which was explained by the fact that the fuel tank was empty. The working theory was that he'd noticed he was low on fuel sometime after he started home and turned toward the main highway where he knew he could buy gas at that hour. He'd obviously run out before he got that far. It seemed reasonable to think he'd simply started walking, since it was only about a mile to the nearest gas station. But what happened next was anybody's guess. Finally, after a week's work with no solid leads, the police had admitted that there wasn't much more they could do. And that's when Harriet called Jess, who sent her to me. I'd worked missing persons cases before, but they were all fairly basic, finding old friends, former employees, or catching up with a rebellious son who'd left home at 16 and not been heard from since. It was usually a matter of doing a bunch of online searching followed by, at most, a few phone calls. There was one young woman I hadn't been able to find for 7 months, but it turned out she'd moved to a different state and lived with friends for half a year while saving up to rent an apartment. That kept her name out of the databases for much longer than usual. But this? Harriet's story just didn't make much sense to me. It all came back to a simple question. If he wasn't dead, why hadn't he called? There was a time before cell phones when some rural areas didn't have phone service available for every home, that he might just be sick or hurt and not able to let her know. But the man had a cell phone, as do most people nowadays, and service was fairly good on the peninsula. It seemed clear to me that he was gone either because he wanted to be, or because he was beyond wanting. Beyond anything. Either way, it wasn't going to end well for Harriet. After briefly flirting with the idea of declining the case, I suggested we meet to talk in person. Why didn't I just tell her I couldn't do it? 2 reasons. First, I owed Jess. She'd helped me deal with the murder of a dear friend the year before, and then put me to work when I needed it. I knew I'd earn my keep working for her, but she'd risked a lot on a rookie. If a friend of hers was in trouble, there was no way I could turn her down. The second reason was that it was an interesting case. I'd like to say I did it because I care, because Harriet's pain touched me, and it did. But as much as anything, I just wanted to dig in and find the answer for myself. Harriet gave me directions, and I headed out. I hadn't seen much of the Eastern Shore on my drive to Chincoteague because I'd gotten a late start. It had been well after sunset when I rolled off the bridge onto the southern tip of the peninsula. What I found in daylight was a single north-south highway lined mostly with tiny strip malls and fields of corn, soybeans, and tomatoes. A fall stench announced the presence of the area's other major industry, a chicken processing plant. I slid the window up and put the air on recirculate, trying not to think about the smell and the flocks of seagulls rioting over the back lot. Away from the commercial areas on narrow, winding country roads, I saw a mix of farmhouses, mobile homes, and small housing developments sprinkled among fields and a few tracts of wooded land. A nice place to visit and drive through, but rural areas like that always make me feel sorry for the local kids, imagining the boredom they must suffer growing up. And there were so many bleak houses that bore signs of neglect and deep poverty. It made the small housing development that Harriet had directed me to all the more striking. They owned a recently built single-story brick house with a view of the Chesapeake Bay between 2 houses across the road. It was lovely, but utterly silent. There wasn't even the sound of birds. When the houses were built, they must have scraped the land clean, because the only landscaping I could see consisted of saplings and clumps of ornamental grass that wasn't dense enough to sustain much in the way of wildlife. When Harriet ushered me into the dimly lit living room, it felt like a house already in mourning. For her sake, I wished there was a small crowd of family and neighbors there, but during the nearly 2 hours I was with her, no one knocked, the phone didn't ring, and no cars even drove past. It made some sense when she told me they'd just moved to the area to help take care of his mom, but it was still so grim. I sat quietly and listened to Harriet tell me the story again, encouraging her to add more details or explain when it seemed relevant. She had an easy manner about her and a gentle, quiet humor that, even in the midst of this nightmare, peeked out now and then. But she was clearly both physically and mentally exhausted, and when she finished, She sat and stared silently out the window, as though she lacked the energy to even think of what to say or do next. "I'm sorry," I said, "but there's something I have to ask." "You want to know if he might have left me," she said tonelessly. I waited for her to continue. After a moment, she shook her head and turned to look at me. "No." She straightened and gave me the most confident look I'd seen from her so far. "I understand why you're asking, but I would bet the whole Commonwealth of Virginia that he'd never cheat on me. Not ever. And Lord knows, he's had opportunity to. Conventions, business trips, late nights at work. Then how?" I paused, knowing she could guess what I meant, and we'd both like it better if I didn't need to spell it out. "Still firmly," she said, "because he tells me everything. He told me the time he got drunk during a conference and called his boss a jackass. He told me when he dented his rental car and reported that he had no idea how it happened. He even told me when his assistant at the bank told him she was in love with him, and he let me decide what to do about it." She nodded to herself at the memory. If nothing else, she was sure of her man's devotion, and for that, at least, I envied her. I don't know whether it's me, or the men I choose, or simply a reflection of the times, but 3 of my last 4 boyfriends had found monogamy too great a burden to bear. Good riddance to them. Of course, it was also possible that she was just in denial. Clients are often wrong, whether willfully or not. "Okay," I said. "Is there any other reason he might take off without telling you?" She tilted her head to the side, giving me questioning look. "Maybe rescuing a friend in distress?" I said. "Helping a family member he knows you don't like?" I frowned, thinking, grasping for something even remotely plausible, and she stared at me eagerly, hoping for more. She seemed to realize I had nothing else to suggest and sat back, looking momentarily numb again. "No," she said. "Nothing like that. I did wonder at first if he ran into someone. Decided to go for a beer and managed to get drunk, then slept on their couch. But of course, as that first day wore on, that got less and less likely. And by now, you've called everyone?" "Yes." She rested her hand gently on a stapled stack of papers on the table beside her. "I called everyone I could think of. Everyone in his contact list in his email program that might have heard from him. Nothing, 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 nothing." Her fists suddenly clenched, her eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed tightly together. I kept going, hoping to distract her. I asked about money, his credit cards, retirement accounts, investments. Nothing had been touched. She'd spent considerable time over the past few days going over the last 3 years' worth of financial data, and nothing seemed amiss. Nothing was missing from the house as far as she could tell. He didn't even have much money with him. She thought it would have been less than $20, since he rarely carried much cash anymore. "Oh," I said quickly, "why is that?" She half smiled. He'd always be donating money, or loaning it out, or just giving big tips to people wherever he went. I don't mean to sound. I mean, I love that about him, that he's so generous. But you see, well, he'd just go through the money so quickly, so we agreed. He carried just enough for a paper, lunch, maybe a few little things, and told everyone his wife had him on a strict allowance. She shrugged, looking uncomfortable. I suppose people thought I was controlling and cheap, but we really couldn't afford for him to spend so much. She looked intently at me, as though waiting for my approval or my judgment. So I said, "Sure, that makes sense." She nodded again and began shuffling through the papers. Based on what she showed me, it was clear they were comfortable financially, though not wealthy by any means. Most of their money was in the house, which was paid for, and their 2 cars. Kidnapping seemed unlikely, but still worth considering, I suppose. Had anyone asked either of you for a large loan recently, or seemed particularly interested in your finances? Not so far as I know. I continued. Since the night he disappeared, especially right afterwards, were there any strange phone calls or hang-ups? No. Any odd letters or packages? She froze. Gosh, I don't know. We don't even have a mailbox here. Everything goes to our post office box, and there's been nothing unusual there. I guess someone might have put something in a neighbor's box by mistake. I asked her to check with the neighbors, glad to have a task to give her, and then I asked for a copy of the contact list. She stood and took it with her to a room down the hall where I heard a copier running. While she was gone, I scanned the room. It was neat, spare, with a faint haze of dust on everything. The furniture was mostly new, in an odd mix of overstuffed upholstery and shaker-style pieces, with a few ornate antiques thrown in. An upright piano stood in one dim corner with a handful of photos scattered across the top. A pleasant room, but it didn't tell me much. Harriet's shoes, navy leather pumps, thudded faintly as she moved from carpet to wood to rug coming back into the room. She handed me the pages, and we sat for almost 20 minutes going through them, page after page. He never deletes anyone out, even people he hasn't spoken to in ages. Tom always says that some of his best times are spent talking to old friends and business associates. He can pick up the phone and call someone he hasn't heard from in a decade or more and talk and laugh and do business with them like they'd played golf that weekend. She smiled, looking almost happy for a moment. I've never understood how he could do that. I'll run into someone I haven't spoken to in 6 months and not have a word to say beyond, "How are you? And you look wonderful." Harriet showed me the code she used when she went through the list, noting which ones she called, which people he knew only faintly, say, through church or Rotary, which were family and close friends, business associates, people she knew he hadn't spoken to in years. I added a few notes as well, including highlighting people Harriet hadn't been able to locate and anyone who lived on the peninsula. After a few more questions, I finished by asking, "Is there anything else you'd like to ask me, or any questions you have?" She stiffened abruptly and looked down at her feet, and I braced myself. She said, "Do you think he's alive?" I paused, trying to come up with the right answer, but there just wasn't one. "I really don't know, Harriet." She sighed and leaned back in the chair, looking exhausted and defeated. I suggested she get some rest and promised I'd call the next day to give her an update. She nodded dully and sat staring straight ahead while I let myself out. As I climbed in and started my car, I felt as though I'd escaped. I was relieved to be away from her grief and fear. At the same time, I couldn't help feeling thrilled to be working on such a baffling case. Together, those emotions brought a truckload of guilt with them. The only thing I could really do to help her was to find her husband, and I needed enthusiasm to do my job well. But did that excuse it? That was another question I wasn't prepared to answer. As I drove out of the Reynolds neighborhood, I called the sheriff's office and made an appointment to meet with a Lieutenant Withams, who was surprisingly willing to talk. We met at a nearby Hardee's and found a quiet corner to sit in. "So, what is it you need to know, ma'am?" he asked, with a large, rough hand planted firmly on the creased and dirty file folder in front of him. A full copy of the file would have been nice, but it seemed unlikely. "How about telling me what steps you've taken so far?" "I'm sure you've been thorough," I added. He raised his eyebrows. "Are you?" "Well, I know your time and resources are limited, but I have a lot of respect." He put a hand up. "Sheriff told me to cooperate, and I will. I don't need my ego stroked." He started by pulling out a map and folding it into about a 12-inch square. "Here," he said, making XS with a blue ballpoint, "is where we found the car. Here's his mom's house, his own home, and the gas station we're guessing he would have headed for." I studied it briefly, asking questions about the exact spot where Tom's car was. I was wondering, could he have gone to a nearby farm or something where they might have had some gas to give him? Withams shrugged again. "That area is mostly a mix of marsh, housing developments, and fields." He turned the map toward him. "Lots of folks have dogs and shotguns, too. Not to mention jobs to get up for, bright and early. That time of night, I don't see a man like him waking someone up just because he was dumb enough to let his tank run dry. But who knows?" I took notes as Withams continued. He had been thorough. He'd spoken with dozens of people, knocked on a lot of doors, checked accounts, cell phone usage, even spoken to a few people at Tom's former job. And the car? He flipped through the file until he got to a report from the state police, who had more of a crime lab than the local department. No signs of blood, no tampering or forced entry. Nothing illegal or out of the ordinary at all, in fact. No papers aside from the manual and registration. Mrs. Reynolds said he'd just cleaned it out, and the garbage all went to the dump. And the scene? No skid marks, no footwear impressions, nothing dropped or discarded. He scowled. Nothing. Just nothing. He listed a few other things he'd done, including checking Tom's credit and his criminal history, which basically got him nowhere. When he was finished, I asked, "Lieutenant, what do you think happened to him?" He pushed back slightly from the table and reached down to adjust the gear on his belt. Finally, he sighed and shook his head. "I haven't the slightest idea, ma'am. There is not one piece of this that makes sense to me. It's that damn car." He looked up to see how I'd react to the curse and seemed reassured by the lack of offense on my face. "Well, if it weren't for that, I'd be sure he'd taken off with some lady. As it is?" He shrugged. I was expecting him to roll in hungover the next day, or for his wife to get some kind of half-assed redneck ransom note. He looked at me more confidently this time, almost challenging me to object to his words. I ignored them and went on. Could he have gotten lost in the woods? He exhaled sharply and tilted his head. "I don't see how." He might have forgotten the woods around here since he moved away, but I understand he's been a hunter all his life. He'd be too savvy for that. Have there been any abductions that look similar to this? Kidnappings? Only on TV, he said. I'll tell you what we have seen when adults have disappeared. The person, man or woman, has had some bad news, usually money or health or maybe a cheating girlfriend, and they've gotten in a car or thumbed a ride on the highway, and they've just vanished. Sometimes they turn up again, sometimes not. But oftentimes, there's just no way to find them until they get locked up for something, killed or hurt bad, or, hell, one guy, real sumbitch. He sent his wife a postcard from someplace sunny telling her how much happier he was not to have to listen to her whining anymore. As if there was something unreasonable about her expecting him to work now and then and help pay the bills. Lieutenant Withams had a mean look on his face as he remembered it. After a moment, he turned his attention back to me and I asked, "Is there anything you can recommend I look into? Anything you didn't have time to do that might be promising?" He leaned forward, resting his chin on his folded hands. "Let me see. Did she give you the list of contacts?" I nodded. I called the top tier, the ones he'd spoken with the most. But there are maybe 200 more on there that I just didn't have time for. I grimaced, and he smiled. And I didn't knock on every single door between the gas station and where we found his car. I sighed and nodded. Okay, I'll start on those. Will you let me know if you can think of anything else that might be useful? You bet. And if you find anything, I'll keep you up to speed. Only with Harriet's permission, that is, but he didn't need to hear that. I followed the lieutenant to the field where the car had been found. There was nowhere to pull off except for the dirt and gravel farm road that Tom had left his car on, and I wanted to leave that clear. The roads were narrow with no shoulder and edged with deep drainage ditches, so Withams obligingly turned on his light bar and waved to me to park in front of him along the road. I got out and he showed me the spot, pointing out various landmarks. There was a trio of rusting bins, wide, squat silos made of corrugated steel that farmers store grain in, just visible above the tree-line. Those bins, I started. Checked first thing. Also the abandoned house beyond those trees there. He pointed toward where I knew the bay was and the 5 closest houses. I walked around for a few minutes, eyes down, studying the ground. There were prints all over, from boots and sneakers mostly, but I knew it had rained heavily early on the morning after Tom had disappeared, so they'd be more recent. I nudged at some trash with my foot and peered under a plastic bag. Withams watched with a slightly amused expression. "What are you expecting to find?" "More than I'd find if I didn't look at all," I said. "I'm sure you already did this, but it never hurts to have another set of eyes." He shrugged, then walked back to his car and propped himself on the hood. I kept going, moving in a spiral pattern out from the car's location. I wanted intensely to find some critical piece of evidence. After 10 minutes, I'd have settled for finding something mildly interesting or even vaguely suggestive. But aside from a disturbing amount of roadside trash, there was nothing that struck me as deserving to be called evidence. Finally, as I saw the lieutenant checking his watch and my own patience began to wane, I gave in and decided to spend the rest of my afternoon knocking on doors. Withams wished me luck, and we drove off in opposite directions. I went house after house that day, well into the evening, repeating the same words. Hi, my name is Lauren Lindsay. I'm a private investigator. I was hired by Harriet Reynolds from over near Craddockville to help find her husband, Tom. Can you tell me about the night he went missing? I met some very nice people, some that were fairly polite, but probably wouldn't tell me if my butt was on fire, some that didn't seem bright enough or sober enough to remember a night 11 days earlier, and a handful that were so creepy that I found myself checking their yards for signs of freshly turned earth or unusually well-fed hogs. After repeating my spiel yet again, one woman asked, through a barely cracked door, "There a reward?" I hesitated, and she started to close the door, so I said, "Sure. Yeah, I'm sure that could be arranged." "Did you see something?" "I might have," she said. "Which night was that, again?" I told her, and she said she saw a man picked up by a maroon sedan around 11 p.m., and I think they was fighting. I got the clear impression she was inventing on the spot in the hope of making some cash, so I asked for a description. The woman hesitated. "Did you see if he had a ponytail?" I asked. "Oh, yes, that's right. I remember he did." "Thanks, then," I said. "Wrong man." She slammed the door, swearing, as I turned and walked back to my car. That was the closest I came to anything useful, and it wasn't anything remotely like close. Withams was right, too. Most of the locals did have dogs. I was sniffed and growled and barked at. A gorgeous black Labrador mix lunged at me so hard that the chain around his neck yanked him off his feet, and he struggled in the mud to stand again, shaking himself. He was more cautious, but continued barking just the same. If I were home in Richmond, I'd have grabbed my pepper spray before wandering through this area. I hadn't thought I'd need it on vacation. Next time, I was bringing it. The next morning, I was awakened by gulls crying and the sound of a small boat as it chugged away from the dock near my rental. For a moment, I wished I was going with them, but then the wind gusted and blew a wave of rain against the front windows. An awful day for a boat ride, but a perfect day for computer searches. I started with the PI databases and found little of interest. The database showed the few places they'd lived. They spent nearly 36 years in the same house in Charlottesville, Virginia, but I found almost nothing of note. He had a hunting and fishing permit, which wasn't a surprise, and it showed his last employment at the Virginia National Bank. The rest was as expected: family, neighbors, a whole bunch of people the system thought might be related to Tom, but probably weren't. It was never easy teasing the meaningful data out from the rest, but I saved the report to refer to later, just in case something came up. Often, the database showed unadmitted bankruptcies, a criminal record here or there. It was always more luck than anything when the system could spit that out, and even suggested a spouse or kids that the person had forgotten to mention. But I already knew Harriet and Tom were married, and their data was pretty straightforward. They had no mortgage on their current house, owned no other properties, and there wasn't even a speeding ticket showing. I moved on to a whole slew of other searches, like newspapers, blogs, and general web searches. I turned up some interesting articles, including a profile of Tom in the Charlottesville Daily Progress, published when he retired. I learned that he was an avid golfer, an active member of Rotary and the local Chamber of Commerce, and had served on the city council for 2 terms more than 10 years earlier. Harriet's name came up in a few similar articles, though she was less public with her activities. I pulled up one story whose title caught my attention: Reynolds indicted for check fraud, but it was Shauna Reynolds, no apparent relation. Her attorney's name was Tom, which is why the article came up. I sighed in disgust and went outside for a quick break. The overhang on the porch protected me from the slow, light rain, except when the wind carried it in my direction. The air was warm and smelled salty sweet, and I wished I could go walk on the beach. I knew there was a short path I could take to get a closer look at the lighthouse that I could see from the small deck, and there were overlooks where I could see herds of wild ponies and flocks of egrets and ibises. And then maybe some nice, fried local seafood for lunch. I wanted so badly to go out and play. Over the last few months, I'd taken scores of repetitive statements in a huge class action lawsuit, picked up medical records, made thousands of copies, written reports, handled stupid questions, and answered phone calls at all hours, all of it critical, urgent, life or death. Then the clients would call with questions that made it obvious they hadn't even read the reports I'd sent them. I complained to Jess about it. She'd referred the law firm to me, but she was less than sympathetic. Brainless paperwork and brain-dead clients are part of the gig, darlin', she told me, and then reminded me how much they were paying. And yeah, that was nice, but I'd barely seen or spoken to friends and family since it started. And as for dating, well, I wasn't sure I'd particularly miss that. Still, I wondered if I'd made a mistake by becoming a PI. Is this what my future would be like? I heaved another deep sigh, went back to my desk, and started plugging keywords into the browser again. By the time the sun began setting and I decided to stop for the day, I had a large file of copied web pages on my computer's desktop, a couple pages of written notes, and a half-dozen appointments for the following day. I'd called a few people that the lieutenant and Harriet had both already spoken with, just because they were the most likely to hear from Tom, his siblings, his best friends, a nephew in DC that he was close with, and some former coworkers. I mostly heard what I expected, a whole lot of nothing, but the nephew, a salesman for Verizon, had some interesting insight. I dunno, he said thoughtfully. Aunt Harriet wasn't happy. I mean, she wasn't, like, miserable or anything. But she was, like, discontent. You know? And it made him feel guilty. Why was she discontent? He cleared his throat. I got the impression he regretted mentioning it, so I said, I can keep what we discuss confidential. And really, anything you can tell me might help. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess she wanted kids, but he didn't, so, you know. She loved him. But then, after he retired, and it's so quiet out there, she doesn't know anyone, and there's nothing much to do, he told me. But, you know, did he say what he was going to do about it? Oh, he said, and I could imagine him shrugging. He said he'd probably buy her some jewelry or take her on a trip. Something like that. I mean, you know, he would never have left. Not ever. I underlined ever in my notes and asked some follow-up questions, but didn't really learn anything else. It was nice that he was so confident about Tom's loyalty to his wife, but people were wrong about that sort of thing all the time. I wanted to believe in Tom, too, but I had to keep an open mind. I updated Harriet and learned that she'd spoken to the neighbors. No one had received any packages or letters not meant for them. She sounded oddly calm, and I wondered if she'd had pharmaceutical assistance. For the moment, though, she seemed okay. The next morning, the sky was still gray, but I was up and ready to roll early. I want to talk with Dan Stockton, the VP of the local bank where Tom and Harriet had their accounts. He and Tom had struck up a friendship shortly after he and Harriet first moved there, and they had lunch about once a week. Dan didn't have a lot to add to what I already knew. We talked about the business world, mostly. He gave me a fair bit of advice, to be honest. Good advice, too. And we talked about stuff like the weather, crop yields, local scandals. That kind of thing. Wish I could help you, but I'm sure I'd be the last person he'd tell if he was planning to take off. After we talked, Dan showed me details of the Reynolds accounts. Harriet had faxed him a signed consent form, and he confirmed that Tom's cards still hadn't been used. Just before we parted company, I asked him the same question I asked everyone I spoke with who knew Tom at all. Where do you think he is? He shook his head. I've thought and thought about it, and I just don't know. I do not know. I'm sorry. The next few interviews with neighbors, the president of their homeowners association, and even Tom's minister netted me nothing new except for the revelation that Tom was really fond of root beer and liked to watch David Letterman after his wife went to bed. The minister thought Tom was a good Christian man, though not terribly interested in scripture. Mildly interesting, but not exactly useful. I ate a late lunch at a shack of a place called Metomkin Seafood, where I had some of the best fish I've ever eaten. I was sitting at a picnic table outside, wiping the last of the meal from my hands, when my cell phone rang. It was Harriet. I expected a request for another update, or maybe a new bit of information. What I got was some very bad news. Tom's mother, Marion, had had a stroke and died alone sometime late the night before. Oh, God, Harriet moaned. I should have been with her. I should have, and she died not knowing, not even knowing if her son was dead or alive. She moaned again, harshly. So help me, if that man just ran off with some woman. She broke off, said, damn, and I thought she was going to start crying again. Harriet, I said, I'm so sorry. I was especially sorry that I hadn't been able to talk to Tom's mother before she died, though I felt incredibly insensitive even thinking it. Harriet sighed and said, you know, I didn't even like her. I don't know that anyone did. She complained so much. Talked about herself and her troubles all the time. But she loved him dearly. And what a terrible way to die. I didn't want this. God, I didn't. She said it so insistently that I was certain she had wished Tom's mother dead, even if only for a moment, so they'd be free of the obligation to care for her. I felt sorry for Harriet. It's the kind of thought people have just because they're human, without any real desire to see it happen. And the worst of it was, this would make life simpler for Harriet. Part of her had to be relieved that the burden wasn't hers any longer. We spoke for a few minutes more, and I updated Harriet on my progress. There wasn't much of it, but I hoped it would help her, even if just a little bit, if she knew that I was hard at work. Once I got off the phone, I headed back to Chincoteague. I sat and reviewed my notes, hoping I'd see something I missed before, but there was nothing. Finally, I pulled out Tom's long list of contacts, scowled at it, and sat down to start dialing. I didn't have high hopes, but I knew from experience that if I worked at it hard enough, sooner or later I'd probably stumble over something useful. As the afternoon passed into evening, I continued crossing names off the list. I made notes about every call, marked a couple that sounded odd, had numbers that were disconnected, or where I got a machine. By 9 p.m., I was starting to lose steam. I took a break and made a sandwich. While I ate, I stared out at the water, lit by the flash of the lighthouse's warning light rotating in a strange long-short rhythm. The sight relaxed me, finally, and I decided to call it a night. It was just past 8 the next morning when I started up again and continued calling for hours. By mid-afternoon, I switched over to the West Coast numbers, which I'd left for last. I was getting ready to dial the 5th California number when I noticed something odd. The man, Ed Gorman, had a Sacramento address, but a Virginia area code, and it looked like an Eastern Shore number. I inhaled sharply and punched the numbers, thinking, be there, be there, be there. Of course, he wasn't. His voicemail answered, and I cursed and hung up. I went online and did a reverse phone search. The results came on the screen, and I shouted, yes, when I saw it. 81, Baycrest Drive, Pungoteague, Virginia. I knew that road name. I'd driven by it the day before. It was near where Tom's car had been found. Less than a quarter mile, and much closer than the gas station, though in the opposite direction. I doubted anyone had thought to look there. I certainly hadn't. I dug in my bag for the map and tried desperately to think of some explanation that would fit. Tom walked to Gorman's house after the car ran out of gas, and they got drunk together. Maybe Tom had gotten sick or injured, and Gorman was taking care of him. I unfolded the map, trying to hold on to my desperate, absurd hope, even though I knew it didn't make any sense. He'd have been home ages ago. But it was too much of a coincidence. It had to tie in. I called the number 3 more times and finally said, screw this, got in the car and started driving. It would take about 50 minutes to get there. I ran through different scenarios in my mind as I drove, and it started making me crazy, so I cranked up the radio and sang along. There was a song about a guy riding his pony on a boat, and another about tractor love. I was no fan of country music, but it passed the time. The road Gorman lived on was a smooth gravel track with trees pressing in on either side. The house, no more than 100 feet back, looked like a 50s-era brick ranch, with large windows and a slate patio out front. There was a light on inside, which seemed like a good sign, but then I saw 2 packages tucked inside the screen door and a soggy flyer for a lawn mowing service plastered to the stoop. I knocked, and for a minute imagined that an amnesiac Tom would answer, looking kindly and confused. But that kind of thing only happens in cheesy soap operas, and it was always the evil twin in disguise. Anyway, neither version of Tom opened the door. After several more attempts and a walk around the house, I had to accept that no one was home. I walked down the driveway to the road, pulled open the mailbox, and found a note taped inside. Out of town family emergency. Please hold mail. Have a blessed day. Lou. At the top was the date the note had been written, 3 days before Tom had gone missing. Damn. I felt like I'd had the wind knocked out of me. After all the work I'd done, this had been my one promising lead. After a few minutes of staring at the ground, feeling sorry for myself, I turned and looked back at the house. It was possible Tom had come here anyway, not knowing Lou were gone. If he'd arrived on his front steps sometime late that night and found the place empty, what would he have done? I headed back behind the house to where I'd seen a shed. Inside, I found a small riding mower, the usual assortment of shovels and rakes, a wheelbarrow, and a few other pieces of equipment. I spotted a gas can under a workbench on the left and jiggled it. It was empty, and I saw no other cans. I suppose he could have taken one with him and walked back to the car. But then what? There was a garage, too, though. Might they have gas stored in there? Would Tom know how to get in to check? I started looking around the shed for the key that I thought they'd probably have hidden there, not thinking too hard yet about what I'd do if I found it. I lifted coffee cans full of nails and half-empty bags of grass seed and potting soil. I was getting ready to climb a step ladder and check the beams when the light shifted and I heard a man clearing his throat. I spun toward the door, my heart feeling like it was trying to break out of its cage, and was both relieved and dismayed to find Lieutenant Witham standing there looking amused, mostly. We got a call that some girl was sneaking around back in here. From the description, I thought it might be you. Something I can help you find. I explained what I'd learned and why I was at the house. Huh, he said. That was good thinking. We talked a while, and I was relieved to see he didn't seem particularly upset about what I'd been doing at the house. We discussed the case in detail, and then he asked, what next? I folded my arms and tried to look thoughtful, because it seemed preferable to admitting I had few ideas left. Did Tom know anyone else down this road? Not so far as I know, though truthfully, I never considered he might walk in this direction. I wouldn't have thought he'd take the chance at that hour. And wasn't Gorman one of the people Mrs. Reynolds said her husband hadn't spoken to in years? Yes, but he had the local phone number in his contact list. They must have spoken recently, or it would still have been a California number, wouldn't it? Maybe he just hadn't gotten around to putting the new address in. Huh, I suppose. Pretty sure the Gormans have lived here for almost 10 years, though. They can't have been close. I nodded. Maybe he saw it as an opportunity to renew their friendship? By asking to borrow gas late at night? I shrugged. Sometimes the best way to get to know someone better is by letting them do you a favor. He thought about that for a minute and then nodded. I tell you what, I said, I'm going to walk from here to where the car was found, just to see if anything jumps out at me. Care to come along? Withams nodded and called in on his radio to let dispatch know where he'd be. We started out walking, and chatted idly about trivial things: the nice weather, the Chincoteague ponies, his fishing trip to the Florida Keys the month before. I told him about fishing for trout with my dad when I was little and the time I ate a worm. He told me about his grandmother teaching him how to knit and the fit his father had when he came home to find his little man sitting on the couch with his sisters, knitting a scarf. We were both roaring with laughter when I saw it, and it tore the laugh from my throat. It was the underside of a boot, submerged in a deep water-filled drainage ditch beside the road, just a short distance from where Tom's car ran out of gas. It might be just an old, discarded boot. It might be nothing, except for the edge of a black and red flannel shirt that was also floating in the water in just about the right spot. Withams noticed I'd stopped and started to ask what was wrong. But then he saw my face and followed my gaze, and he knew too. We'd found Tom. "Sweet Jesus," he said, and reached for his radio. What followed had little to do with me. After they'd removed the body from the ditch, I went with the lieutenant to tell Harriet. She saw us coming up the drive looking grim and collapsed, racked with sobs. Her minister was there, and he promised he'd look after her. I felt guilty, again, for the relief I felt at being able to walk away, but I could see that Withams felt it too. I suppose it was natural enough. I went back to the office with him, answered a few questions, and gave him all my contact information. I made Withams promise to let me know what the medical examiner found, and he said he would, and we said our goodbyes. And then, the sun still high in the sky and the day stretching before me, I got in my car and headed back to Chincoteague. If it was a hit and run, it was a matter for the police. If it was accidental, a fall, maybe, or a heart attack, then it was just a shame. In either case, my part in it was done. I had another week of my vacation left, and suddenly that seemed terribly long. I reached the turn for my rental and instead kept on driving. Now that I had the time, I was finally going to climb to the top of that lighthouse and see if the view was any better from there.